everybody. For those of you who are joining us live, good afternoon. My name is Gary Painter, and I am the director of the Price Center for Social Innovation. We are here today to have a really important conversation around issues of how social innovation approaches can improve the housing outcomes that so many people are facing right now. And I think it's safe to say, and I'll say a little more about this, that things are precarious for many people who are living here in California and living throughout the United States, even further around the world. At the Price Center, we were established 10 years ago with a transformative gift to the Price School from the Price Family Philanthropy. And in that gift, they wanted to make sure that part of what we would do at the Price School is to focus on innovative solutions to some of our most pressing problems. In fact, our mission is one that I think will resonate with many. And it's to develop ideas and illuminate strategies to improve the quality of life for people who are living in low-income urban areas. This is the third of a series of convenings where we've had an opportunity to discuss how social innovation intersects with these problem-solving approaches around issues of reforming the criminal legal system, addressing education inequality, and then today talking about housing insecurity. The fourth event is actually in person at the University of Southern California, and is going to include a fireside conversation with myself and former HUD Secretary Julian Castro, former presidential candidate, and certainly has many other luminaries behind his name. We're really excited to have him join us to kind of complete the 10th anniversary celebration of the Price Center. And I hope that for those of you who are in the Los Angeles region, you can join us as well. So what I'm going to do just to kind of begin is to give a little bit of framing, and then I'm going to be pleased to turn it over to our moderator for today's event, Professor Ann Owens. So I'm going to share just a few slides to make sure that we can level set around what social innovation is and how it intersects with some of the complex problems that we face around housing. I'm going to start with a definition, and this is a definition that was developed with colleagues here at the Price Center, Professor Christine Beckman, and then Professor Giovanna Rosen was with us here at the Price School and the Price Center, and now she's a professor at Rutgers in Camden. When we think about social innovation, we think about it as an iterative, inclusive process that intends to generate more effective and just solutions to solve complex social problems. For us, we really are thinking about, I think, three features that I like to highlight. First, that we are going to follow an iterative approach, anticipating that the solution is unlikely to be kind of found the first time we try something. The second part, and certainly these are not in any order. In fact, I'd probably give primacy to this one, that it's an inclusive process. That means that we intentionally include stakeholders that have often been excluded from these processes of social change, and to even out some of the power dynamics that exist while still including people who might hold political power and or economic resources and economic power. And then I think it's important to kind of think about, what are we trying to solve with social innovation? When do we want to activate such a process? And that's when we have complex social problems. Many times these complex social problems are of our own doing. It's very clear with housing that many of our problems are of our own doing. We have had exclusionary zoning, exclusionary policy, specifically targeting members who are not of our communities that are not white, preventing them from buying in particular places, and from actually accumulating wealth. And so that's just a set of things, and the list goes on in our housing markets. Here in California, we have absolutely made conscious decisions to reduce the number of people who have their own units by just simply not building. And to that end, we are in a situation which is extremely precarious for so many households. In that sense, I think it can be argued that traditional policy approaches have not yielded system change. And so when we think about social innovation, we're thinking about how we can link those iterative and inclusive processes to these problem-solving solutions. And just as an illustration, this can be helpful, this may not be, but to think about this iteration and kind of how you move from co-producing ideas with people and communities around who are experiencing some of the impacts of, in this case, housing instability or housing precarity. And how do you innovate to kind of come up with new ideas? How do you learn from them? And I think what is important here is both the start point and the end point, but that there is a bias toward learning throughout this process, that we anticipate learning rather than identifying the perfect solution throughout this process. So today we're going to be looking at the intersection between social innovation and housing. And so we have to talk specifically about why would we need social innovation to address these housing issues. And I'm going to lay it out by talking about the complex social problem, and I'm going to use the term housing precarity. Again, a synonym could be housing instability, housing insecurity, the fact that so many people who live in, for instance, in Los Angeles are renters. We know that over 60% of our renters are paying more than 30% of their income as rent. This is what I refer to as experiencing higher levels of rent burden. We know that in the decade preceding the pandemic, the rate of rent burden increased by about 1 percentage point, meaning that more and more of a population were going across thresholds of paying more than 30% and 50% of the income as rent. We've seen over time higher rates of eviction. This again is thinking pre-pandemic, and this is kind of marching of the expense of housing and the value as an asset class of housing, and the relative lack of power that residents had vis-a-vis landlords and or the public sector. And then finally, we see here in Los Angeles increasing rates of homelessness, and in many ways, this is the most stark outcome that comes from housing precarity. And so when we need to think about solutions, while I'm kind of noting solutions here, potentially, I think I'm actually, maybe I said that in a different way than I intended. We're actually not going to kind of provide the solution today. We're going to help us understand what can be done, what levers of power need to be activated. And so when I say we need to reimagine universal housing assistance, I'm not thinking of just the traditional voucher system. The traditional voucher system we know fails people who are eligible. Only 1 in 5, given the latest data, people who are eligible actually receive that housing choice voucher. So what are we going to do for people eligible but pay more than 30%, more than 50% of their income as rent? We do need to reimagine the power relationships that exist between landlords, renters, and government. I think the outcomes around eviction suggest that something needs to shift. And we need to reinvent multiple systems. Housing, certainly, but it intersects with our criminal legal system, intersects with our systems of social support in order for us to actually end homelessness. So with that background, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ann Owens. Dr. Ann Owens is an associate professor in sociology, public policy, and spatial sciences across the University of Southern California. We all enjoy working with her so much, and I have the privilege of also working with her in the Price Center, where she serves as an associate director. Her research centers on the causes and consequences of social inequality, with a focus on urban neighborhoods, housing, education, kind of geographic and social mobility. Her research also examines how social policies can be used to reduce social inequality. And now it is my real privilege to welcome Dr. Owens and the rest of the panelists to our conversation today. And the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you, Gary, for that welcome and overview of the social innovation process. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator for today's conversation, to start to think about where we can innovate to promote housing stability for all. And I'm joined by 2 esteemed panelists, Gustavo Velasquez and Diane Yentl, who I will introduce fully in just a minute. But first, I want to build on some of the issues that Gary mentioned and set the scene for our conversation to describe this complex social problem that we're here to discuss. So I'm going to, summarize the housing crisis in 8 minutes so that we can proceed with our conversation with some shared knowledge. So as Gary mentioned, rent burden is widespread. I think the COVID-19 pandemic quickly revealed pre-existing crises in so many of our social and economic systems, especially housing. So prior to COVID-19, nearly half of all renters were rent burdened, spending more than a third of their income on rent and utilities. And this figure on the left shows that this share has been pretty substantial and persistent for the last 20 years. Among low-income households, 80% are rent burdened, and the share of middle-income renters who are rent burdened has increased by 20 percentage points since 2001. Here in California, where a lot of our work focuses, an even greater share of renters is rent burdened. A quarter of renters pay more than half of their income for rent. The Center for Social Innovation's Rent Burden Project revealed that more than half of renters here in Los Angeles cut back spending on food, clothing, and other basic expenditures to afford rent. So nationally, statewide, and locally, renters are barely hanging on. And when affording the rent becomes too much, households are at risk of becoming homeless. So we're still talking pre-COVID. In January 2020, nearly 600,000 individuals nationwide were unhoused, and the number of unsheltered, unhoused individuals has increased 30% since 2015. Unsheltered, unhoused individuals are particularly relevant here in California, home to more than a quarter of all individuals experiencing homelessness, and the state with the highest rate of unsheltered, unhoused individuals. And these burdens are not born equally. Black and Hispanic renters are more likely to be low income than Asian or white renters. And Black renters, especially Black women, are disproportionately represented in eviction filings. So this figure on the right shows that Black households make up about 20% of renters, but 30% of those facing formal eviction, and probably a greater share informal. So how did we get here? As Gary said, we have made choices, and those choices have resulted in the fact that we just haven't built enough housing. Here in California, the state's new housing plan, which I look forward to hearing more about, estimates that we need to create 2.5 million homes in the next 8 years across income brackets. And Diane's work at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, data from that institution show that no state in the country has sufficient rental stock for low-income renters. In California, there are only 24 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low-income households. And even for folks at the median area income, there's a shortage. There's only 87 affordable and available homes per 100 renters here in California. So our housing supply has lagged drastically behind demand, leading to climbing costs and competition in the housing market and the need for many more affordable homes. And our existing federal assisted housing programs, can potentially alleviate the housing crisis by offsetting high rents through housing vouchers and by producing or preserving affordable housing. But this figure on the left shows the dramatic decline in the late 1970s and early 1980s of spending on housing assistance, which has never recovered. And as a result, only about a quarter of low-income renters receive any sort of housing assistance, often after being on wait lists for years. So expanding programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program could have a dramatic impact, not only on housing stability, but also in terms of cutting the poverty rate by a substantial amount. So for decades, we've had this housing crisis. Traditional housing policy has not solved the problem. And then entered COVID-19, which in addition to causing nearly 1 million deaths, disrupting lives and families in untold ways, and the conditions of which we're still living in today, presented innumerable other challenges, including severe economic shocks that threatened households' abilities to pay rent and landlords' abilities to pay mortgages on rental properties. The federal government responded with eviction moratoria and some of the largest expansions of the social safety net that we've ever seen. And in addition to federal supports, states also enacted programs to promote housing stability, each of which operated in different ways. So these programs were intended to provide temporary relief in the face of this acute crisis, but there are perhaps lessons for housing policy in the face of our chronic crisis. In the social innovation framework, we are always learning, and these interventions provide a set of policies that were tried out in different ways across the country that we can potentially learn from, diffuse, and scale up. And housing intersects with neighborhood inequality. In the United States, we face persistent racial, ethnic, and economic segregation between neighborhoods. And this matters because of the historic and ongoing structural racism and other systems in our country that mean that neighborhoods of lower income and Black and Hispanic households tend to have lower opportunity for children, measured in a variety of ways. So it's not just separate, it's unequal. This figure from the Child Opportunity Index shows that nearly half of Black children and over 30% of Hispanic children live in neighborhoods with very low levels of opportunity, in contrast to less than 10% of White or Asian children. We know that where you live matters for your future, so providing housing in high opportunity areas is an important intervention. Our federal policies, however, have largely not made that intervention. Voucher households tend to be overrepresented in low opportunity areas. Only about 20% of supply of affordable housing is in such neighborhoods, but double that, 40% of voucher assisted households with children live in these areas. And the low-income housing tax credit program, our predominant supply side and production program for affordable housing, disproportionately locates units in high poverty areas. So our federal housing programs therefore have perpetuated rather than disrupting racial and economic neighborhood inequality. So addressing the affordable housing crisis thus presents an opportunity for also addressing neighborhood inequality. In California's new state housing plan, historical patterns of housing segregation and exclusion are noted as a key cause of our housing crisis, and housing advocates nationwide agree that equity has to be a tentpole of new ideas for housing policy. Increasingly, housing policymakers are grappling with how to meet the fair housing goal of affirmatively furthering, purposely promoting, whatever alliteration you want to use, fair housing goals. California, like many states across the country, has adopted an opportunity map in many of its housing programs that grades neighborhoods on their resource levels. So considering where housing is built is critically important for neighborhood inequality and environmental and climate justice, but determining the most effective fair housing framework is challenging in the face of multiple and competing goals and challenges like cost containment, the need to rapidly increase supply. So there's trade-offs in thinking about investing in historically disinvested neighborhoods and promoting access to higher opportunities in already resource-rich places. Okay, so that was a lot, but it boils down to this. Housing affordability is a chronic crisis with severe consequences. We don't have enough housing. Traditional housing policy has not solved the problem, and housing instability is born across households and neighborhoods of different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups unequally. So to meet this challenge, we need innovation in policy and politics, public opinion, financial models, and other arenas as well. To discuss the opportunities in this moment, I am delighted to welcome our panelists. Gustavo Velasquez is Director of the Department of Housing and Community Development in California. Prior to joining and leading HCD in 2020, Gustavo served as Assistant Secretary of the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD, where he led efforts on affirmatively furthering fair housing. Diane Yentl is President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Previously, Diane served as Director of the Public Housing Management and Occupancy Division at HUD and was Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Enterprise Community Partners. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and welcome to Gustavo and Diane. And for the next about 40 minutes, we're going to be in conversation and dialogue with one another, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. So you're welcome to pop questions into the chat as they come up, and I'll do my best to get through those at the end. But let's jump in and get started. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you. And I want to follow up on a point that I mentioned in my presentation. So I'm curious about how you both are thinking about the lessons we can take from the federal and state programs that were launched during the pandemic. You know, do these provide learning opportunities that we can bring into hopefully one day a post-pandemic world? And what are the possibilities for using these programs to leverage new permanent resources? Diane, I'll start with you. I'd love to hear your perspective from the work that you've been doing, and then Gustavo would love to hear from you as well.
Sure, glad to get us started, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here in conversation with you both. In terms of lessons from the pandemic related to affordable housing, first I would start at the highest level, the biggest picture. And I think some of the very clear lessons are, one, that advocacy works. When the pandemic arrived in our country and our movement for housing justice saw the threat that it posed to the lowest income renters and people experiencing homelessness, we mobilized with a singular focus and were able to achieve truly historic protections and resources for those renters and for people experiencing homelessness. The other very related lesson there is that, sure enough, just as many of us have been saying for many years, that the only thing that we lack to end homelessness and housing poverty in our country is the political will to fund solutions at scale. And we had our proof point during the pandemic. Sure enough, when policymakers saw and believed the threat, they acted. And again, we achieved things in the last 2 years unlike anything any of us have achieved in our lifetimes. Finally, the other big picture lesson is clearly that those same inequities that you described really well that existed for low-income renters, predominantly people of color, before the pandemic and during the pandemic, will continue to persist after the pandemic unless and until the federal government provides resources on the scale needed to truly address these issues. More specifically, we had a tremendous opportunity to learn how emergency rental assistance can work. And even before the pandemic, this was something we were working towards. We were working on, and we did in fact have bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate. This was December of 2019, to create essentially a cash assistance program to help renters who typically can make ends meet, but have a financial shock and are at risk of eviction, stay stably housed. And at that point, in December of 2019, we were thinking about creating a pilot program. And then over the last 2 years, certainly we've had our pilot program. We've learned a tremendous amount about what works, what doesn't, how we can most effectively essentially get cash into people's pockets to pay the rent and stay housed. And some of the lessons we learned there are related to having applications and programs be as simple and as accessible as possible, and doing very purposeful and deliberate outreach, equitable, robust outreach to the communities that need these resources the most. And on Project Room Key, Project Home Key, which I know Director Velasquez will have a lot to say, and I will leave it to him to say it, but I just want to add that California led the way for the country in very early on seeing the opportunity and the need to take new resources and essentially redesign, rethink how we respond to the immediate needs of people experiencing homelessness. And they led the way and created a model for much of the rest of the country to follow. And they were doing it so early that they were really taking a leap of faith, jumping into this new idea with the hope and the expectation that the resources would meet them. It did. And they also proved that we can redesign our shelter system into something that is much more humane and much more of a way that actually meets the needs of the people who go to the shelter system or people experiencing homelessness. Now, of course, we need the resources to continue these best practices and take them to scale.
Great, thank you. And Gustavo, I invite you to respond and talk about California as well.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to the Price Center for the invitation. I love the frame, your frame, Ann and Gary, in terms of housing instability and really addressing the no stability side of the equation, which is the homelessness crisis, and then the other side, which is the crisis of housing affordability, very little stability in housing given the tremendous cost of housing and the need for more affordable housing here in the state. And I'm very honored to share this conversation with Diane. Diane has been a steadfast fast advocate for so many years, so helpful back in my old fair housing days when we promulgated the 2015 fair housing rule at HUD. And recently, I mean, we can certainly point to Diane and the coalition for the congressional action to put in place $45 billion in rental assistance, COVID-related rental assistance that has, in California, spared nearly 250,000 households from eviction, thanks to that federal appropriation of rental relief. And I, since Diane mentioned homelessness and room key and home key, I just want to say that in terms of solutions, we knew early on when the pandemic was starting that unhoused people who were infected by COVID were potentially 2 to 4 times as likely to require critical care and 2 to 3 times as likely to die from COVID compared to the general population. So we had to act very quickly. Governor had leadership on this front, initiated Project Roomkey, the first of its kind in the nation, leveraging FEMA funding to provide temporary housing for those who tested positive or were exposed, and those at highest risk for medical complications should they get the virus. And in the first 6 months of the pandemic, the state was able to lease 15,000 rooms in hotels and motels and help nearly 40,000 people that were unsheltered going to these facilities. It was a coordinated effort between FEMA and a host of state agencies. This action obviously was born out of a medical necessity, but it also proved to be a critical intervention to help people experiencing homelessness, not just stabilize and access services, but move to eventually permanent housing. And at the time, the governor was clear that he wasn't going to stop there. And thankfully for the infusion of federal investments coming the way of the states, that provided an opportunistic moment out of a catastrophic public health emergency to go further. And so that's when we decided, why don't we start buying properties for permanent housing? That's how Home Key came about. Today, between round 1 and where we are currently, the second iteration of Home Key, representing close to $2 billion investment in interim and permanent housing. And nearly every week, as we speak, we're making more awards. Over a 2-year period, when every last dollar is given out, this will add more than 16,000 units of permanent supportive housing, serving every region in the state. And some of the biggest lessons learned, not just for California, I would argue, but for the country, improving ground for the concept that unused real estate assets can be quickly put to work. Speaking about innovations in the field, quickly put to work as housing for those experiencing homelessness. Only if we prioritize dollars well, and if we become a first housing model nation. California is a state, first housing model state, but we need the entire country to move in that direction. So Home Key built upon that and became an opportunity for state, regions, local public entities to buy this broad range of housing types, not just hotels and motels, but single family homes, multifamily apartments, adult residential facilities, even commercial property. And time again, it has shown that you can build this type of housing at 1/3. That's the number we have, 1/3 of the cost of new construction. And in record time, of course. 6,000 units were available in less than 6 months, about 70% of them with local service providers on site. That's the second lesson. The third lesson is you need, obviously, the hand of policymakers to expedite these conversions. Hugely important. I think it was in fact the projects were often cases exempted for CEQA, for example, and local approvals. A lot of push back to this type of housing, but if you have the help of policymakers to exempt some of those local approvals, obviously it's going to make things much easier for the state to execute this program. Having said that, there was community opposition, it's still there in some places that resulted in projects never materializing, but obviously it was the exception, not the rule, and local governments oftentimes went back to the drawing board and tried again. And it's, again, a lot of very good lessons out of this, no longer experiments, I would say. These are programs that are on their way. Yes, we would need a lot more funding, federal investments, but we are, as you have seen from the two most recent budget cycles, on the cusp of creating that momentum that will allow more state appropriations to keep these programs going for the future.
Great, thank you. And you both mentioned sort of political will and the importance of coalitions and social movements, and I want to circle back to that in a moment. But I want to also pick up, Gustavo, on some of what you were saying in the last point about ways to sort of accelerate and fund the production of affordable housing. So, the way that we build and provide and preserve affordable housing today is a very complex, public-private partnership. There's multiple funding streams, there's stringent regulations. I've been interviewing low-income housing tax credit developers, and they tell me this, and one of them recently told me that building affordable housing is like trying to balance a stack of tennis balls, which I thought that was a good mental image. But that seems like a process. How do we get this housing built as quickly and as safely and as high quality as possible? It seems like a process ripe for change and innovation. And Gustavo, I'd love to start with you and hear, some of the innovative and promising models that California is trying out right now, like the Housing Accelerator and the Supernova.
Right. No, thank you for that opportunity. So it really is like a three-legged stool, right? To accomplish all the things that you just mentioned. It's the right policy climate. So to make sure that we are deregulating, that we are making streamlining on the policy front, helping state and localities get rid of the stack of barriers, that make development, especially affordable housing development, so costly and time consuming. The second is capital. We all know that this is an issue. We can buy ourselves out of this problem, but certainly capital will continue to help to scale to the level that we need to in the creation of more affordable housing. And the third is, administratively, what can we do to accelerate production, streamlining funding processes? So I can talk about the third one, but it really starts at the State Housing Department and this concerted effort with the governor's office to streamline, right? We just issued a multifamily finance supernova and super notice of funding availability. Is a very wonky name, but which I just want to say we had this multifamily housing program since the late 90s. Over the last 20 years, the legislature created no fewer than 9 other separate rental housing programs, each with their own distinct requirements and their own timelines. Developers certainly hate everything I'm saying, but the analogy about stacking tennis balls is on target, right? I would add to that once one ball falls, it takes a lot of time to chase it down and not let it slip through your fingers again. So what we have done is work with the stakeholders and interested parties over the last 18 months to figure out how to put all of this in a single application and a scoring system to make coordinated awards for all of the programs at one time, while still retaining the unique intent of each program, whether it's a veterans housing program or a just straight multifamily, less than 50% of AMI program. But I'm pleased to say we did it. It was a group effort aided by input and advice from all parts of our stakeholder community. We have just announced $650 million in our first super consolidated competition. And we also redefined what the best projects are to look like. No, not only ones that make decent use of resources, but ones that also are mitigating climate change, are advancing racial equity. We know the problem of still racial segregation we're confronted here in California, addressing homelessness. And we have aligned the criteria, all of these priorities for winning projects, for those with private bonds and tax credits, which is obviously part of the affordable housing finance delivery system that is much more robust than any subsidy that our State Department provides. And all of this should result in more infill, transit-oriented, more density development and projects, again, that are geographically equitably across the state, not even in urban areas. And that's one step that we've taken. You mentioned the Housing Accelerator, nearly $2 billion investment to go and fund shovel-ready projects that have enabled to obtain tax credits because of the huge demand in the tax credit market. So we are just doing everything we can to streamline, consolidate programs, make sure that there is more certainty and readiness and much more time efficiency in the ability to put all of this capital, whether it's federal or state, in the hands of developers that want to build affordable housing, especially deeply, deeply affordable housing.
Great, thank you. And Diane, I'd love for any reaction and from your kind of national perspective, what you're seeing and what you're thinking might be necessary at the federal level to kind of streamline the production of affordable housing.
Well, I think the work that Gustavo's leading is innovative, important, excellent, in an impossible situation where clearly nobody would have designed from the outset. If somebody were going to say, let me design a system to enable developers to build affordable housing, nobody would have designed what we have today with so many resources, with so many sets of rules and regulations, inspections, and so on. It's an impossible situation that states and cities are in. And at its core, the challenge is the scarcity of resources. So none of these programs are funded at the scale that is so clearly needed. So it requires the cobbling together of multiple resources to make an affordable housing development work. So yes, we need to do more streamlining, more innovation. There have been efforts at the federal level as well. HUD has led multiple, over many years, multiple efforts with some success to really streamline the rules and regulations for these multiple federal resources that come from HUD. USDA has done the same. There have been cross-department efforts to streamline. That's good and important. It makes life a little bit easier for people at the state and local level that are trying to use these programs. But we shouldn't lose sight of what's most needed, which is funding these programs at the scale necessary. The National Housing Trust Fund is a really good example of an incredibly important program, the only federal development program, a block grant that goes to states to build and preserve apartments affordable to extremely low-income people, those with the greatest and the clearest needs. And its funding level is a drop in the bucket compared to the need. This year, it got its highest funding level ever of around $700 million nationally. And especially talking to the state of California, you really feel how small that is in comparison to the need throughout the country. And so that means that housing trust fund dollars can almost never be used on its own for its intended purpose. It has to be tied together to so many other resources, which takes longer to build, makes it more complicated and ultimately more expensive. If we were to have a funding level like what's in the Build Back Better Act of $15 billion, or what several senators have supported, $45 billion annually, then Gustavo could really do some work if he had a funding source that could actually meet the scale of the need locally. So we do need innovation, we do need to streamline, but we can't lose sight of pushing policymakers to actually fund proven solutions at the scale necessary.
Yes, and this leads me into the next topic in thinking about all the things that housing and housing programs are asked to do in the face of this scarcity. So in addition to providing safe, decent, and affordable housing for some of our neediest citizens and residents and neighbors, we also, can potentially leverage affordable housing to provide access to opportunity to tackle some, persistent, decades, centuries long issues around racial, ethnic inequality. So, Gustavo, I heard you talking about aligning sort of, climate priorities and equity priorities, and then to hear Diane talk about, the scarcity, it seems like a really hard balancing act. So I would be curious, Gustavo, I can start with you, of just from your perspective, how do you think about the challenges of, balancing concerns about equity and the potential of housing to be a tool to promote equity versus just the urgent need for sort of more supply? How do those things, is it possible to thread that needle?
Well, thank you. The law in California is pretty clear, right? Local governments are required in their planning for more housing. We are entering, we have this, I'm sure we're mostly a California audience here, and so they will be familiar with the term RHNA, right? The regional housing needs assessments that happen roughly every 8 years. The planning cycle for this upcoming 6th cycle is underway. Numbers came out. That's how the 2.5 million new homes between now and 2030 came out in our recently published statewide housing action plan. That's what the state is required to create between now and 2030. And the question is, how the plans have to be submitted. The 6th cycle requires these local governments to take concrete steps to affirmatively further fair housing. Those the state law and the requirements to affirmatively further fair housing never went away, not even when Trump put on hold the 2015 federal rule. In the state of California, that was codified in 2018 into state law, and it remained even when Trump was in office. So I don't think achieving equity balance and getting housing online soon are mutually exclusive. They are complementary strategies that can be achieved. One of the key challenges to achieving any of these goals is public resistance to affordable housing. Affordable housing development is still actively attacked in certain communities in our state. Exclusive communities, we find, are marshaling their resources to stay exclusive. Unfortunately, I just have to say what it is. However, the good news is, that ACD now has, the State Department has now more and more enforcement authority, thanks to that state policy climate that's been advancing year after year after year in the state legislature, and the governor has supported to ensure that NIMBY communities, others who would act as barriers to affordable development, are confronted. Our enforcement and accountability unit stands ready with support from the Attorney General's office to do its best to make sure all jurisdictions in the state comply with housing law. But again, before enforcement, it starts with planning, the right planning in areas that affirmatively further fair housing. We are in the 6th cycle housing planning review at this time. And so we're ensuring that those AFFH requirements are in place. And if we have to go to the step of enforcement, once this housing starts getting built, then we will do that. But the law is pretty clear about what is required right now for localities to work with the state to ensure the racial equity is factored into these housing plans.
Great, thank you. And Diane, I know that fair housing is a pillar of the National Low Income Housing Coalition's work as well. So I'd love to hear your perspective on kind of how we inject racial and socioeconomic equity into this, addressing this problem.
Sure, we have an obligation to center racial equity in our work. Deliberate, purposeful, racist housing policies over decades created the tremendous racial disparities that exist today. So these racist housing and transportation policies, they put homeownership out of reach for millions of Black Americans. creating this yawning generational wealth gap that exists today. Those who were able to, despite against all the odds, were able to become homeowners were then disproportionately targeted for predatory loans and had much of their wealth stripped during the Great Recession. This shows up then in who are renters, where Black and Latino people are disproportionately likely to be renters, to be extremely low income, to pay at least half of their income towards rent, or to be homeless. So just as an example, Black Americans make up about 13% of the general population. There are 40% of people experiencing homelessness. There are 50% of people who are homeless with kids. Those kind of disparities don't happen by accident. They happen through deliberate, purposeful policy. And it's only deliberate, purposeful policies that can correct these disparities and reduce the harm that's been done. So we have an obligation to center racial equity in the work. Doing so, part of that obligation is also to listen to people who are most impacted and to have them lead the way towards the solutions. And the question of balance between, do we build affordable housing in historically disinvested communities, or do we build it in areas that are so-called higher opportunity with better schools, less crime, better access to transportation and jobs? We have to do both. We have to do both, because when you talk to and you hear from and you listen to people who are themselves extremely low-income renters, you see that there's a real diversity of opinion. And in these historically disinvested communities, we need affordable housing, and we need to invest in all of the other aspects of that community so that it is also a higher opportunity neighborhood. Not everybody wants to move, to the white suburbs. Some people want to stay, and especially people with disabilities, especially seniors, where that is where their social network is. They want to remain. And when and if those communities start to gentrify, when the other investments do come in, it's the affordable housing that is an anchor that lets those long-term residents stay. At the same time, when it comes to families, especially with young kids, there's a real urgency to create more opportunity. There's a whole set of research that shows the long-term consequences that can come when kids grow up in neighborhoods with lower performing schools and more crime. So we have to also be working towards creating those shorter term, those quicker, those more immediate opportunities for families to move to areas that do have higher performing schools. So we have to do both. And again, of course we have to do both. I think we all know and believe that. And again, it comes back to the only reason why there's a debate at all is because there's a scarcity of resources. Again, if we had enough resources, we would be building and maintaining and preserving affordable housing everywhere it's needed. So again, it comes back to the need for getting funding at the scale necessary for all these programs so that we don't have these impossible choices to make.
Yes, I agree. And I think you also talked about, listening to the perspectives of the low-income households and underserved communities in which affordable housing is sorely lacking. Gustavo, you had mentioned how sometimes some of the loudest voices in this process are folks who are pushing back against building affordable housing in their neighborhoods. So I'm curious, Gustavo, if how HCD thinks about, integrating the voices of prospective tenants, of people who need affordable housing into policymaking.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. We think innovative housing programs work best when you have those that these programs are going to benefit early on, engaging with us to help shape how these programs will work, will look, will be implemented. This was an instrumental part of HomeKey, where even before we put pen to paper on how to set it up, we met with those who had a high likelihood of becoming an applicant, all of these local jurisdictions. We needed to go and meet the communities where they were. And as we continue to evolve the program, many of the changes were ones that came from their experiences with us and were incorporated into the later rounds of under the home key construct. The same is true in the development of the multifamily, the consolidated program that I mentioned earlier, this super funding program that combines different programs into one. We couldn't have done it without the involvement and contributions of our stakeholder community upfront and throughout the development process. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to Housing Finance Roundtables, Black Developers Forum, the Disability Rights Coalition in the state of California was pivotal in how there were elements of the scoring criteria, how we end up developing, funding these programs with very much the accessibility lens. Just one small but important example of how you have to design these programs with that kind of a stakeholder input from the living experiences. Even in the development of our statewide housing plan, which you, when you were doing your framing, you mentioned, we reached out far and wide for input. Different listening sessions, public surveys, consultations with the state and national experts, ranging from academics to practitioners, work with other state agencies to finalize the plan. So I think it's critical. I am a member also of the Interagency Council on Homelessness. We are going through the same sort of iteration of the stakeholder engagement as we recalibrate the homelessness plan for the state that will be announced later in the year. So start with those with living experiences as we design these programs, but go farther than that. Experts, people that have on the policy front, seen what models, what innovations work best.
Great, thank you. And I want to end, we'll open up our Q&A in about 5 minutes. So if you haven't put your question in the chat, please do so. And I want to circle back for my last question to thinking about politics and to get from each of you, whether it's at the California state level or the federal level, it seems like there's been, housing has been more and more in the conversation than I think it has been in quite some time. California has passed some streamlining bills at the state level. At the national level, President Biden ran on a platform that included universal housing vouchers. I'm just curious, now it's 2022, there's a lot of problems and challenges in the country and internationally to address. We have, I guess I'll just stop there, but I'm curious from each of you, sort of your assessment of what is this political moment with regard to housing policy? How do we leverage political opportunity coalition building to advance significant housing policy innovation? Diane, I can start with you on that one.
There's so much to say about that. I'm trying to figure out where to start. First to say it is an incredibly unique moment for all the obvious reasons related to the pandemic, but also that we have policymakers talking about housing as a human right, talking about the need for universal housing vouchers. And that too didn't happen on its own or by accident. That was a lot of pressure that advocates and organizers and impacted people throughout the country put on candidates during the presidential campaigns, such that we had about 14 candidates putting out robust plans for how they would address the affordable housing crisis that were light years from the kind of plans that we saw even in the presidential election prior. So that resulted in having a president who says housing is a human right and we need universal housing vouchers. That's tremendous progress. The question then is what we do with that commitment and how we actually realize it. And there too, in the last 2 years, because of the pandemic, in part because of the way impacted people and organizers and advocates mobilized, we had tremendous success in getting the kind of protections and resources from the federal government, in some cases unlike any in the history of our country, like an eviction moratorium, $46 billion for rental assistance. So now all of those resources, all of those protections were only ever meant to plug some of the gaping holes in our social safety net and keep people stably housed. We have to turn now to actually repairing the social safety net and achieving these long-term goals. We came so close with the Build Back Better Act, which is not dead yet. We are still pushing and ready to mobilize. Again, it's still possible, but it is stalled and it is maybe taking its final breaths. And what happens next then is dramatically different. This moment of opportunity where so many factors aligned to create this chance to get $150 billion in transformative investments, this opportunity is not going to come again for a while. And we have to recognize that we may be now moving into a very different political environment next year at the federal level, where control of the House and maybe the Senate may flip. We may be back in a defensive posture where we are looking at oversight hearings, allegations, false allegations of fraud in some of these programs, attempts to claw back the money, a very different environment that we have to prepare for, but we can't spend the time simply maintaining the status quo. So we have to be innovative. We have to look for those opportunities, and there are, to find bipartisan solutions and push those forward. But we can't have this conversation without being very frank about the tremendous disappointment and the tremendous missed opportunity that we might see this year, and how differently we need to look at our work in the coming years. Similarly, the backlash to homelessness, and the more homelessness becomes visible, the greater the backlash seems to be. And that also presents tremendous challenges and real risks for people who are sleeping in encampments and on sidewalks. So we have a lot of work to do. And unfortunately, at the federal level, we still have an open window, but it's closing fast. So we have to do everything we can to make the most of this moment and try to achieve these resources now when we still can.
And I'll just say very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. I mean, we are concerned, right, about what we're seeing at the federal level. We had earlier this year, an opportunity for the federal government to provide more bond and tax credit capacity to states. I mean, that would unlock a huge amount of more affordable housing creation, and that doesn't seem to go anywhere. Vouchers. We know that if programs like Home Key are going to be sustainable over the long term, we need a lot more voucher capacity through federal funding. That right now is sort of at a standstill as well. So we are worried from a perspective of the largest, most populous state in the nation. We are worried about that climate in Congress at the moment. At the state level, things on the policy creation front seem to be okay. I mean, we've had years of so many pieces of critical legislation that has advanced, streamlining the creation of hundreds of thousands of more accessory dwelling units, removing barriers, removing regulations, housing accountability, affirmatively further fair housing. Last year, SB 9. It's a lot of conversation right now about potentially CEQA reform. You all saw what happened recently in the situation in Berkeley. I mean, I'm here in front of a university crowd, so I'm sure you followed that story about limiting university enrollment because there isn't enough housing. This tool that's been used often to block housing development, CEQA. There's conversation about that. So every year we see the legislature, the government kind of pushing to the next frontier. What are the policy advancements to spur more housing production, especially affordable housing, densifying, creating a better sort of regulatory landscape. But at the end of the day, we are going to need the help of the federal government and of Congress, being the largest state in one of the biggest problems that we confront, housing affordability. and the homelessness crisis. So we just keep waiting for better results coming out of DC. We're optimistic, but I echo Diane's concerns as well.
Great, thank you. And thank you for this conversation. And also thank you to both of you for the incredibly important work that you're doing and continue to do on this issue. You're both just exemplary leaders in the field. And I know I'm really grateful to have had this conversation. So we will open it up to Q&A. I'm going to read the questions. And I'm going to start with a question from Saba Muine, who is the Managing Director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute here at USC. And Saba asks, given the rehabilitation and conversion capacity seen in Project HomeKey, are there opportunities for innovation or efforts on large-scale engagement with corporations or the private sector to develop housing in newly unused office space, which we're hearing so much about in our central cities? Gustavo, I can start with you for the California perspective, and Diane, feel free to jump in as well.
I'm glad the question was asked, because we are just this year launching a fairly robust adaptive reuse initiative. Came last year out of conversations with the state legislature and the governor about the lessons that we learned from HomeKey, how adaptive reuse strategies can be pivotal to scale initiatives like HomeKey. And so we are beginning to have those conversations with innovators in the private sector that have used mechanisms of adaptive reuse to convert commercial facilities and other types of assets into affordable housing. We just needed some, seed funding to get this started, and I'm glad that came our way. So we are just beginning to have those conversations right now. I think that between a combination of that and another initiative that we're trying to launch around use of better sustainability methods for construction, is all about use of technology to lower cost on the material side. We know we're having right now a huge problem of inflation. Lumber went up 40% higher in the last 12 months. I mean, we're just seeing tremendous explosion of cost of material. So we just have to think about sustainability methods and materials that can lower the cost of construction. So just keep adding to the toolbox in order to ensure that we have the scalability that is needed to build 2.5 million new homes between now and 2030.
Dan, I'm not sure if you had anything to add, or I can jump to the next question.
It's incredible work, and all of you in California should feel really good about your government's leadership and ambition on these projects, because it's different from anywhere else in the country, really. California was first and is most invested still. The questioner got right to the point of the idea early on in the pandemic was to get people experiencing homelessness to safety, recognize that there were a lot of vacancies at that point in hotels and motels, and sort of marry the two needs to get people to safety, and it worked. And then the question was, well, what happens when the funding for those hotel rooms ends, or when the hotel owners want those rooms back? We can't end this experiment moving people back to the sidewalks they were sleeping on before the pandemic. That's an unacceptable outcome. So this idea of converting some of these properties into affordable housing, refilling some of the single room occupancy housing needs that has been there for a long time and hasn't been filled in other ways. And there was $5 billion provided by the federal government through the HOME program to support states and cities to do this, to convert properties. And it could be office spaces, as the questioner suggested. There are other communities that are pursuing this, but really none at the scale or to the effect that the state of California has done.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Barbara Bowman, and they ask, during this gap period while waiting for units to come online, do we have any thoughts to address rents today? Specifically, we have a ton of funding in LA County to house people with vouchers or rapid rehousing funds, but we can't house them because of existing supply side issues. can either of you speak to the sort of need for rapid solutions in the face of these challenges?
Well, I can start us off by saying that another piece that we didn't mention yet is the state and local relief fund dollars that communities got through the American Rescue Plan, $350 billion to states and cities with tremendous flexibility and many allowable uses for those funds. So right now, as we're in a time where emergency rental assistance is already or about to be depleted, where tremendous needs remain, there is this big pot of money that states and cities can and should use to supplement these programs to meet the needs of renters who fell behind during the pandemic, and to use other innovative solutions to create bridges to the long-term solutions that certainly we need from the federal government. And we've been tracking and digging into how all the jurisdictions are using their state and local relief fund dollars. We've found that about 12 billion of the 350 billion is going towards housing and homelessness, which is good. That's a significant amount of money. There's a lot more that could be used for this purpose. And certainly there's other immediate needs that states and cities are using these funds for, but more of it certainly could be used for this purpose and should be.
And I would just put up a fine point on the issue of supply in LA. Of the 2.5 million new homes needed between now and 2030, the LA City Master Housing Plan or housing element that is currently under review by the state calls for LA creating more than 400,000 of those units, more than 90,000 of those for people that are extremely low income or very low income. So the conversation right now between the city and the state is very much on the capacity in the city to augment the rezoning necessary to augment and the likelihood of development for all of those additional units of housing to be created in the next year in the city of LA. It's a tremendous task by city leaders, but we are seeing great leadership from the city of LA, as well from the county. I mean, the county has another 200,000 plus units that have to be created. So it's going to be an enormous task what we see in LA in terms of housing supply and the need for creation of more housing in the next 8 years.
Thank you. And to kind of come at the need for rapid solutions in a slightly different way, we have a commenter who discusses homeless encampment clearance, which is a very hot issue in Los Angeles. And the questioner is asking about, sort of social innovations that can perhaps avoid or prevent these anti-camping laws. And so this isn't really something that we've discussed. I'm not sure if either of you feel like it's quite in your purview, but obviously related to kind of on the ground what's happening now in terms of how do we get people into housing as soon as possible from encampment. So I don't know if you want to speak to sort of temporary shelter ideas or anything else related to the idea of anti-camping laws and clearances.
Well, there is 3 times as much funding this year for encampment resolution than it was last year. I think the governor has, we're not administering that program, but the governor has been decisive in ensuring that we have more encampment resolution, especially in the LA area. And we are, it's an effort that involves the Interagency Council on Homelessness with the strong participation of course, the continuum of care, as well as the state social services and human services agency. And so we're very coordinated in an effort to ensure that whatever resolution is implemented for still dozens, hundreds, arguably, of encampments, that we do so in a thoughtful way and we get as much support to the local level as possible so that these individuals are properly placed in situations that are more stable than where they are now.
And I would just add to that sweeps of homeless encampments should not happen unless there are housing options for people to move into at any time. And during the pandemic, the CDC was very clear that encampment sweeps during the pandemic risked lives and disrupted social systems that kept people safe and healthy. And still cities moved forward with encampment sweeps. And whether in or out of the pandemic, they should not happen unless and until there are adequate affordable homes for people to move to. When you sweep an encampment without having options for people to move into, all you're doing is disrupting people's lives who are doing the best they can in incredibly challenging circumstances. Sometimes they are losing their belongings, their very limited belongings in the process, and they are only going to show up on another sidewalk or in another park somewhere else in the city. It's a game of whack-a-mole. It costs money and it hurts people. And it shouldn't happen unless, and I recognize that that's really challenging in some communities where the affordable housing options are so limited and where the solutions are, years in the making. But still, we have to lead with humanity and against cruelty.
Thank you. I'll read a question now from Jae-Hyun Choi, which takes us to a wonkier place, but I guess we have the right panelists for that. So they ask, the city of Los Angeles adopted the Affordable Housing Linkage Fee Ordinance in 2017 to bring funding to the city's affordable rental and homeownership program. How effective do you think the Housing Linkage Fee program is in LA? Housing linkage fees have given rise to concerns that they may decrease housing ability, or that developers will pass the fees to home buyers in the form of higher house prices. So if either of you have any response to thinking about affordable housing linkage fees as maybe one arrow in our quiver of approaches to funding here.
I would say that this is an excellent topic from someone from the Price Center to do a review of the housing linkage fee locally and come up with some recommendations for improvement or some way. I do think that linkages fees can work. In my experience before I came to California, I worked for the Urban Institute, and we started exploring linkage fees in New York and in Chicago, and the potential for them worked in one city and did not work in the other in terms of its effect. I don't think LA's linkage fee has been studied enough. So I think it will be premature for me to comment on its impact, its effectiveness. But hey, the Price Center, take it on, please.
Okay, students and RAs, Gustavo has just given you your dissertation topic, and you can report back in a little while. Okay, and then I think I want to end with this last question that also touches on something that Gary mentioned in his opening comments, and this idea of how housing is sort of intertwined with all these other systems. So we have a question from Andrea Muir, who says, Gustavo mentioned a plan to address homelessness, which will be announced later this year. How will upcoming state level plans integrate with Medi-Cal programs such as enhanced care management, which are designed to address all social determinants of health, including homelessness? So happy to hear both the California and kind of the national perspective on how do we think about housing plans linking up with these other systems.
Dan, you want to go first or you won't? Okay, well, Let me just clarify about this homelessness plan. So there was a homelessness action plan released by the state last year, but new legislation created the Interagency Council on Homelessness. It used to be called the Homelessness Coordinating and Financing Council. And the purpose of that legislation was to insert as part of the, similar to the Federal Interagency Council, a much more healthcare, mental health participation from state experts and state entities into the council. That participation of healthcare, mental health, social services was not, that presence was not as robust and intentional in the previous iteration of the council as it was with this new legislation. And medical is certainly the opportunity for medical to be inserted in the equation of how localities act on the creation of homelessness support systems and the creation of even housing. Is very much part of an update of this homelessness plan that will be released as a result of legislation later this year. So it's yet to be seen how that medical will be incorporated in the plan, but I know conversations are underway for it to be much more intentional in the use of homelessness plans at the local level.
Great. Diane, I'm not sure if you wanted to respond just more generally about, sort of ways to think about housing as intersecting with these other systems.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, one of the things that we've benefited from as a movement for affordable housing, for housing justice over the last decade has been this increasing amount of research that makes such a compelling case for how central affordable housing is to so many other areas of our lives. We know that when we are affordably housed, we're healthier, our kids do better in school, we earn more over our lifetimes, we pay more in taxes, we even live longer, depending on where we live. So this conversation about how to engage non-housers in the work of affordable housing has been going on for some time. A lot of the way that it's been moved forward has been around funding sources, new funding sources for affordable housing, which is from the healthcare field, which is very good and important. We've kind of taken a different direction with the same need and the same conversation, which is to engage leaders in non-housing sectors in the advocacy for more federal affordable housing investments. And it's been quite successful. We have a campaign called the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign that has a steering committee of about 20 national organizations, the vast majority of which are not housing organizations. They're from the healthcare sector, the education sector, civil rights, faith-based, local government, anti-poverty, anti-hunger, beyond, who are convinced that they're not going to be successful in reaching their own goals of increasing kids' educational attainment or improving families' health until more people are affordably housed, that they're joining with us really effectively in advocating for more federal housing investments. So that's one piece of what makes me hopeful that we will achieve the level of investments we need in the future, because we have these new, really effective advocates who can reach policymakers from a completely different vantage point and get them to the same place, which is taking investments to scale.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you both so much. As Gary predicted, we haven't, innovated to solve the housing crisis in these 80 minutes, but I think that you both have raised a lot of interesting ideas and strategies and highlighted things that are already going on across the country, as well as highlighting the fact that at the end of the day, we need more resources, and that's going to involve policy work and advocacy work. For our audience, I'm just going to pop in the chat quickly the state's housing plan website, if you're a California audience member and you're curious about some of the things that Gustavo mentioned, and I'll also pop the website for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition as well, so you can see some of the great advocacy work that Diane and her team are doing as well. But we will close there. Again, thank you to Gustavo and to Diane for providing your insights, and thank you to the audience for your great questions. So thank you very much. And again, I'll plug the final event in the center's celebration of its 10th year anniversary in 2 weeks, featuring Gary with a fireside chat. I'm not sure if we actually have a fireplace, but it would, well, and it's California, so we, maybe we shouldn't do that, but we'll be chatting with Julian Castro. So hope to see many of you that are local there. Thanks very much.